remember back in the day, when you seasoned food, you always seasoned with salt or sugar or fat. I don't remember coming to the table and having peas or beans or corn without a pat of butter sitting on there providing the flavoring for it. Well, as we go into looking for more healthy ways to eat, we're also looking for some ways to get rid of those old favorite flavorings and build some flavors in other ways. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. All right, the first way we want to talk about it is using fresh herbs and spices, which is an excellent approach to this. Keep in mind, however, that most of them, even the sturdy ones, are fairly delicate. So some of them you're going to add right towards the end, things like cilantro or mint or basil are going on right at the end. And some of the other sturdier ones you're going to add no more than probably 20 minutes ahead for the most part. Also, when you're bringing them in, you need to work with your supplier so that when you're ordering them, you're telling them what you want, the quantities that you want, but you also need to be there at receiving, because if you get basil in that looks like this, it's not going to be of great use to you or anyone else, but you're still going to have to pay for it. So make sure you're there with receiving. Make sure that you store them wrapped well, maybe with a little bit of dampness in there if they don't come prepackaged with some kind of dampness. Not so that they're wet, but so that they don't wilt. You also want to make sure that there's not too wet so that they don't get moldy. So we're bringing them in fresh. Some of them are going to be sturdier, some of them are not. Some of them are also going to be available in a dried form. And you can use the dried forms equally as well, but remember that you're only going to use about a half to a third as much of the dried form, because it concentrates the flavor. So if you're normally using a fourth of a cup of a fresh herb, you're going to drop it down to no more than 2 tablespoons to maybe even 1 tablespoon and work your way back up. These are going to be nice flavors that you can get kids used to, but it may take a little bit of time for them to actually get to the point where they do accept it, because it may be something new for them. So as the year progresses, you may be able to increase the amounts on some of these, but start kind of small. All right, the dried herbs, also it's going to depend a little bit on when you add them. Most of the time, if you're using them, you'll have a recipe that you can go by. So that's useful as well. But if you find that you have a recipe that calls for a ground spice, but you only have the stick version of cinnamon, for instance, and you don't have any way to scrape it down, if you're using the stick form, it's going to take a lot longer for you to extract the flavors from it. And so you're going to add it earlier on and let it sit in there and simmer with something than if you have the ground form. So that would be the same whether you're using stick cinnamon versus ground, or cloves versus ground cloves. You're also going to find that you have some herbs in particular that are going to be dried that are going to be needed to add very early on. This, for instance, is a bay leaf. And in order for you to pull all the flavor from a bay leaf, you're going to have it in the process with simmering, and so with the other ingredients. If it was a pot roast, for instance, you'd put it in there about an hour ahead of time. If you don't have it in at least an hour, you're not going to get as much flavor coming out of it. So that's one of the differences there. Other things that you can use in addition to the herbs and spices will also add a lot of flavor. There are some aromatic things that we've been using forever, and most of us don't even think of them anymore as flavorings so much as just ingredients. Some of those would be onions. Others would be garlic, shallots. These are all in the same family. However, they all have a little bit different flavors. So if your recipe calls for a red onion, it's probably going to be a little bit sweeter than a yellow onion and milder than a white onion, but it varies on onion per onion. So while you may think you have a handle on that, it's always a good idea to cut it, smell it, taste it if it's something you're willing to taste, to make sure that you know what you're adding in so that you have control over the flavor and the flavors don't just take you down the road on their own. Other things, this one is fennel. This is another good choice. You can either add the fennel bulb itself as a vegetable, or you can use the fronds as part of the seasoning or part of the aromatics. Another thing that we often use would be different kinds of stocks or different kinds of sauces. So here I have a stock. Now you may be more used to using canned broth, and that's fine when you're making soup as long as you're using the lower sodium version. But if you have the opportunity to make either a vegetable stock or a meat stock from scratch, so to speak, you get a lot more depth of flavor because it takes a long time to do it. So there are ways to get around it. As I said, the canned one works very well. This one has a little bit more flavor, perhaps a little more depth. but you can get it fairly close by using the canned. Other things that you can add would be something like soy sauce or fish sauce, those kinds of things. They may also contain some glutamate, which enhances the saltiness or makes the fullness of the food that you're tasting, and the other ingredients makes them seem more rich. Mushrooms have a lot of that as well, so if you're adding mushrooms to something, it gives you more than just the mushroom flavor. Unfortunately, it also gives you the mushrooms, and you may run up against some of that opposition for some of the kids or faculty as you work through it. But again, it's something that you work through until they develop an appreciation for these different things, not let them discount you from using it simply because they didn't like it the first time you gave it a try. A couple other things that you may want to try that don't add a lot of salt or sodium or fat: mustards. There's tons of different kinds of mustards. Here we have one kind. You may find that there are the yellow mustards, the brown mustards, the spicy mustards. All of them add something different to the foods that you're putting together. Last one that I have on the cart here would be citrus. Citrus is a very common way that we season fish, for instance. How often have you sat down and had fish and chips and somebody squeezed a lime over it, or a piece of tilapia and somebody squeezed a lemon over it? So citrus is very common, but remember, all citrus can do very much the same kinds of things. So if you have some grapefruit, you may want to try that. Oranges are another good choice. And it's not just the juice itself. You can also pull little bits or strips off the peel and use that zest to really boost the flavor of whatever it is that you're working on. So we have lots and lots of ways to work away from the fat, the sugar, and the salt, increase flavor, build those flavors over the process of the time that you're cooking, so that you end up with something that is familiar and yet totally distinct and terrific tasting. I hope you'll give these a try. Build the flavors for your kitchen.